Asked, it's an excellent question about what it means. So let's actually start with that. So we're moving back to this late 3rd, 4th century, right? Can everybody see these numbers here? No. No? Well, unfortunately, I don't really know how to fix that problem, but is there a way to move this up, or? It's not really going to work that way because
it's too small. You can put Control plus. Yeah.
Well, it's actually you have to play slides to do that. Can you play?
Yeah. But then we can't scroll, right?
Right, that's the thing.
Yeah, it's good.
If you can control the projection.
No, it's not right.
Okay.
How about Control plus didn't work? No. This is even harder. All right.
Well, I think we'll just have to, if you stand up or something. But anyway, I'll try to sound out what I'm saying more carefully. How's that? All right. So this is late 3rd century, late 3rd and 4th century, Fatimids in Egypt, Hamdanids in Syria, Zaydis in Yemen, and Buyids in Iran. Buyids in Baghdad and Iraq, and then you have in the region that is Iran and Khurasan, that is eastern Iran. It is ruled by Samanids and Safavids, who are actually Sunni. So what is life like here? All right. As I said, societies learn to live without government interference. So majorities, these are Sunni majority societies, all of them. They are living under Shiite rulers, but Shiite rulers have very little influence on how people's religious lives. And of course, the ulama, Sunni ulama, are threatened by the fact that that the Shiites are ruling them, and the Shiite rulers are trying to influence, but all they can do is, if you will, fund and encourage Shiite theologians. But other than that, they have little power. And they don't even try. There is no inquisition or persecution of the Sunnis under the Shia, or vice versa. So when you have Sunni rulers, you don't really have an active persecution of the Shia either. Governments don't really interfere from now on. Governments don't really interfere with religious life very much. Now let us look at just to capture some of the comments that I have made earlier already. In the early period of establishment of the Ummah in Medina, and then you have in rapid expansion phase in the Caliphate al-Rashida, and then a vision of Islam at this time is what I call an Ummah-centric vision. That is, the Ummah is considered to be the carrier of the mission of the Prophet ﷺ. There are, as we talked about earlier, in the time of Muawiyah in the time of Ali and then Muawiyah, there are Khariji revolts that could be seen as nomad reaction against against Muslims trying to establish a state.
Dr. Can you see the year as they're coming up?
Well, this is, as you can see, these are years, first 40 years. So all this is happening in the first 40 years. And then the Umayyads come to power in the year 40. The Kharijis continue, and the expansion continues. But one of the things that happens, major changes, is that Khilafah is said to turn into mulk, kingship, right? And this is seen as a refrain, meaning people say that as a matter of criticism of the Umayyads. So you are no longer king, Khalifas, you are kings. There begin at this time Shiite and other revolts against Umayyads. So Shiite, before Kharijis were the main problem, but after the Zaydis and after the problem of Karbala, the Shiism picks quite a bit of steam, and a different vision of Khilafah, of the Ummah begins to compete. And that vision is Caliph-centered or ruler-centered vision, where rulers become distant from the people and they begin to assert their religious power. And this is exactly what Ma'mun is trying to do in the Mihna, as we saw. As we say, then we move to the Umayyad period, Abbasid period. Instead of expansion, they focus on consolidation. And they try to recruit the ulama and the other elite in the empire as their a sort of coalition. But later there begins, as we will see, provincial rulers become more and more powerful, and the empire begins to disintegrate. During this time, there is this interesting development, what I call localization and vernacularization of Islam, meaning that Islam in Persia begins to be expressed in Persian language, Persian lingo, local language, local dialect. There are Muslim scholars of Persian heritage who go and preach to Persian Muslims in agrarian lands, far-off lands. So in this period, Islam is no longer, so far Islam has been an elite force in these large lands, in this large expanse of land. Now Islam becomes localized and vernacularized and becomes accessible to people. And this is what gives rise to, again, this is historical, if you will, theorization. I mean, this is the best knowledge we have. I can't really say this is the fact, but this is when most of the conversions, mass conversions in Iran and Egypt seem to be taking place. In a way, you could say that, think of conversions to Islam in America, in black America. Islam comes to black America through indigenous movements such as Nation of Islam, Moorish Temple, Science Temple, and whatnot, that have very little to do with Islam. They are very local problems, local movements, response to local problems, a reaction against the oppression of Christianity and the kind of basis Christianity provided for slavery. So Islam is seen by blacks as an answer. It's a religion of social justice and whatnot. But it is not theologically Muslims, right? They're not theologically in any way connected to Islam, Nation of Islam and whatnot. But what they make possible is they take Islam to the masses, to ordinary black Americans. They make Islam palatable. They make Islam digestible. So that later when Wahid Muhammad comes and converts to Sunni Islam, all of a sudden you have tens of thousands of blacks convert to Islam. That's the kind of thing that's happening, if you will, in Iran and Egypt and other regions. That Islam first comes in vernacular forms, and then there are reform movements, and people in large number begin to follow Islam. All right, this is the Shiite century from 950 to 1050 in Common Era. That is 10th to 11th centuries, or 3rd to 4th centuries. Okay. In terms of intellectual history or scholars, a lot of people I know are interested in the relationship between politics and religion. So in the early period, political and religious leadership are united. As we know, the Khulafa are seen as both religious and political authorities. And the distinction between their political part of their authority and the religious part of their authority is simply not clear. So that people will go, if they have a question about law, they're living in Medina, they would go to Umar to ask the question, because Umar is also the most knowledgeable man. If Umar didn't know, he would call the Sahaba and say, well, what did the Prophet say about this, right? So there is no clear distinction between political and religious authority at this time. And as we see, when the people begin to see that the Umayyads are turning away from the ideal, that there begin to emerge private circles of knowledge in different regions around companions and tabi'een, or the successors of the companions. These are the people that are later going to become what we call the ulama. At this point, there are circles of students around the companions. What does actual practice of law, like if you have a problem, if you're getting divorced or married, whom would you go to right now? If you're in the Umayyad period, you would go to a qadi, and the qadi is an official who is appointed by the Umayyad Khalifa to judge the people according to the Quran and the Sunnah. But that Quran and the Sunnah exists in a very, if you will, primitive way, that there isn't any systematic knowledge. So the qadi would apply the Quran and what the part of the Sunnah that they knew at this time, because Sunnah hasn't been compiled in Hadith, so that they're ruling by Islam. As far as the people are concerned, there is not even a question that there is secularism or there is any other source of knowledge, source of legitimacy. There is absolutely no doubt about this part, okay? The only question that the ulama are beginning to ask is that, are you appointing these qadis? Are they competent are they the best knowledgeable people in the Quran? Or are they simply the people who happen to be your cousins, or people who happen to be from your tribe, right? So those problems are emerging. And that's why people like Abu Hanifa and Malik and others begin to, if you will, compile knowledge away from government in an increasingly academic way. To give you a simple sense of the people that we know, Imam Abu Hanifa dies in the year 150. So that's Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Shafi'i, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So it is during this period that these great founding imams live. We talked about the mihna and the significance of the mihna, and how after this mihna, the Khalifa no longer challenges the ulama in their religious authority, right? And now, about a century after these great imams, the madhhabs begin to emerge, and at this point, madhhabs are Hanafi madhhab, Hanbali madhhab, Shafi'i madhhab. At this point, they're really academic schools. They're not like, if you ask ordinary people in this century that you're a Hanafi or a Shafi'i, it would not make sense to them. At this point, madhabs really meant that if you are learning law, Islamic law, if you're learning fiqh, you would either go, and usually you would go to the scholars, great scholars in your region. So if you're an Egyptian, most likely you will go to a Shafi'i or a Maliki scholar. If you're a Kufan, if in Iraq, you go to Hanafi scholars. If you're in Medina, you would go to the students of Malik. If you're in Damascus, you go to the students of Al-Awza'i, and so on. So rise of fiqh madhabs then becomes the big fact that we have to understand as far as religious knowledge is concerned. That becomes a very significant fact. And increasingly, these communities of legal scholars become followed by Muslims. Ask that, of course, the way fiqh developed in Islam has to do with the specific political circumstances, with the corruption of the rulers, but at the same time, it has something to do also with the fact that Islamic law and the way the Quran works, it does not establish, it does not give authority to either the political or religious leaders. So Quran is a very egalitarian text, meaning that it believes in the priesthood of all believers, and that's why the fiqh, for both political reasons and internal reasons, fiqh in Islam develops as a rather bottom-up enterprise, okay? I want to emphasize this term, okay? Bottom-up enterprise. Does anybody understand what I mean by bottom-up? Right? So it's not a law given by a pope, or by an emperor, or by a state, or by a bunch of officials that, you know, a Khalifa said, come together and put together a fiqh for me. None of that. Law in Islam is developing, and as ordinary believers and their leaders, their ulama, are proposing theories like Shafi'i and Malik and Abu Hanifa, and some of them become, and now at this time there are many other schools. Some people will say as many as 100 schools or 100 different scholarly circles, of which you have 6 of them are quite successful, and later they get reduced to 4. Okay? Another thing that's happening at this time, early on, remember in the Ma'mun period that we talked about, or the Abbasid period, is the first wave of Hellenic influence. By Hellenic influence, I mean Greek sciences, that brought in Greek logic and Greek politics, and you know, and so on. And that is one of the reasons why Ahl Sunnah become what we may call xenophobic. They are afraid of what these foreign sciences will do to the truth of Islam. Whereas the Khalifas, right, they are, because they are in power and authority, they're open-minded, and they're embracing and they're open towards foreign sciences, but they run up against Ahl Sunnah, against, if you will, popular religion. And we know that mihna is a result, it's a result of that. A little bit later, there is a second wave of Hellenic influence. Now, another thing that we haven't talked enough about is that in the 4th century, another movement develops in theology, what we call Kalam. Okay? And Kalam is a very important, Kalam is directly related to the Mihna of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Because what happens is, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, as we know, because it becomes clear that Ahmad ibn Hanbal and the Sunnah, they are now at the center. Now Hanafis, many of the Hanafi scholars had been with the rationalists, they had been a little bit Ma'mun, but they also, Hanafism also moves in the direction of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But Ahmad ibn Hanbal was not a theologian, was not a theoretician. He was not somebody who wrote, who took the arguments of his opponents one by one and said, look, now you're wrong. Rather, he simply said, bring me an argument from Quran and Sunnah, and I will agree to you. Right? So, Mu'tazila, even though after Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Mu'tazila lost their power, they were kicked out by the Khalifa, right, who became a follower of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, but they did not lose their intellectual power. Intellectually, they were defeated by the Ash'aris. So who are the Ash'aris? Well, Ash'ari, so there is an important scholar, Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, who, beginning toward the beginning of late 3rd, early 4th century, who writes, who is a great Mu'tazili debater. He's the super Mu'tazili superstar at the time. He converts to Ahl Sunnah or the position of Ahmad ibn Hanbal in the year 300 exactly. So he moves to the position of Ahmad ibn Hanbal and becomes a defender of the doctrine of Ahl Sunnah and the doctrine of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. However, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the followers of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the Muhaddithin or Ahl al-Hadith, who now are becoming known as Hanabila or Hanbalis, they do not accept the conversion of Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari. Their attitude is thanks but no thanks. Why? Well, they say because you're bringing the tools of our enemy to defend us, and we don't need that. We don't even want their tools. Whereas a large number of people needed more than hadith to believe in the doctrine. In other words, ordinary people needed rational arguments, right? So this Ash'ari, Imam al-Ash'ari, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, slowly becomes a very important figure because he uses the arguments of the tools of the Mu'tazila and the kind of reasonings they had in order to support the Hanbali Sunni position. Okay? This is the beginning of Ash'arism. Another thing that happens toward the end of this century with the rise of Ash'arism is that Ash'aris begin to now theorize. That means they begin to theorize. That means they begin to systematically write about the place of Khalifa in Islam in these times. And this is the birth, if you will, of Khilafah theory, and the great Imams that we know who have written about it, Al-Mawardi and others, they come after this. Now, what is really interesting and ironic is that ulama, as I said earlier, ulama opposed the Khalifa, not Khilafah, they didn't oppose Khilafah, they opposed Khalifas, they opposed corruption of rulers when the Khalifas were actually in power. But when the Shiites came to power, the ulama turned around and became the biggest supporters of Khilafah. Right? Hanbalis and all of the rest of them became supporters of Khilafah. And it is during this time that Ahl Sunnah begin to write books about, it is part of Muslim our Aqidah to have a Khalifa, and the Khalifa needs to have such and such characteristics, and this is how he is elected, and so on and so forth. Yes?
So when we say the split of Sunnis, what did they split in?
So what happens is that many of the Sunnis who are interested in, who follow Ash'ari, Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, they are what we're going to call pro-Kalam Sunnis. They become pro-Kalam, and those people who rejected this new method of defending Ahl Sunnah, they're anti-Kalam Sunnis or Ahl al-Hadith. So these two groups continue to call themselves Sunnis. They both call themselves the real Sunnis. And this split between the Sunnis continues until today. Between Ahl al-Hadith, who said no thanks to Kalam, and those who embraced Kalam, the tools of their enemies to defend their doctrine.
In brief, what does it mean when one says Ahl al-Kalam? What is it that the Ahl al-Hadith they were rejecting? Was it the logic? Was it the rationalism?
Well, that is a difficult question because that requires a lot of elaboration of what Kalam meant.
Or basically just in summation, what was, I guess, maybe the main reason that Ahl al-Hadith, what was the main issue that they had with Ahl al-Kalam? Was it the process or the synthesis?
The reason is, I'm saying it's complicated, is because at the time, Ahl al-Hadith did not even care to explain what their problem is. So we don't have any systematic explanation of it until 2 centuries later when Ibn Taymiyyah came, and he explained what the real problem was with Kalam. And according to Ibn Taymiyyah, the problem was that in converting, if you will, from Mu'tazilism to Sunnah, al-Ash'ari had brought in many of the presumptions and many of the basic understanding of what reason is and how one is supposed to reason. What are the things that one is supposed to, what are the kinds of questions one asks. There were a lot of these remnants of Greek learning and general foreign questions that had come into Ash'arism. That Ibn Taymiyyah says that Ash'ari was a completely sincere Sunni and believer, yet his mastery of what the Ahl Sunnah were really saying was quite weak. In other words, he understood of Ahl Sunnah only the main doctrines, the uncreatedness of the Quran and this and that. But he didn't really fully understand what they were really after. So this was his critique. What Kalam actually meant, I'll have to spare that for now. That will be another 2 days.
And just last point.
Sure.
Because this is, I guess, talking with Brother Yasser earlier, and I don't know, maybe, I guess it's the end of the presentation about what's going on today in the Ummah. Like you see the thought of, the Salafi thought today versus their contention with, some of the thought from Al-Azhar.
Yes. So Al-Azharis are Ash'ari. Right, so and the debates between Salafis and Azharis are essentially the debate is similar to the debate between Ahl al-Hadith and Ibn Taymiyyah on one side and Ahl al-Kalam on the other side.
It's still going on.
In some ways, yes, it's still going on, although it keeps changing its forms, and they're both becoming more sophisticated in the process. Right, so it is in conflict, especially if you can respectfully understand the other side, because the debates between the two are real sophisticated, real philosophical debates by the time you get to 5th, 5th, 6th century. And they really are, I think, very important debates that you can't brush aside. Yes? Okay. All right, so now let's move to what we call the classical period. Right, so this what we saw the Shia century was the transition century, and now we have moved into a new world. In this world, their Khalifas are really unimportant. They are just by name. The real rulers are called Sultan. So this is the age of Sultana or Sultanate. Okay. So who are the rulers here? Now, how does the world look like? So, let me give you the big map once again. So in Arabia, this is the center, and then Syria, Egypt on one side, and Iraq and Iran and Turkestan and Afghanistan on the other side. We were talking about the birth of Sunni theory of Sunni Kalam, and one of the interesting developments is Imam Abu Hassan al-Mawardi writes his famous book Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, which is considered the main treatise on Sunni theory of Khilafah. This happens in the 5th century. Now what's interesting is that the main development is that these guys, this light blue is Saljuks. Saljuks are Turkish tribes that come into the Muslim world from northeast, and they kick out the Buyids and many other Ghaznavids and many others, and as you will see, they established themselves in Iran, Khorasan or eastern Iran, Iraq, and in parts of Syria. That's a big chunk of land, and it's in fact even so anyway, and these people become champions of Sunni Islam. All right, this century is called the century of Sunni revival. And it's a very interesting kind of revival. It's a revival, a reaction against the rise of Sunni dynasties, Shi'ism, of Shiite dynasties in the last century. And one of the things that the ulama learn is that you're going to have to make compromises with rulers who may not be legitimate khalifas. They have no shura, they don't come from the family of the Prophet or the Quraysh, they don't have any of the credentials or piety or personal knowledge, but you have to deal with these rulers like the Saljuks as the best defenders of Islam. All right? Even though themselves they may not be best practitioners of Islam, and in fact in many ways they're culturally, you could say that the ulama and the people of the cities would see them as savages. These people don't really belong in the cities, Because by now Islamic society is very civilized, and by civilized I mean both in a good and a bad way. But so they're not used to the kind of rough life that the Sahaba lived. So the Seljuks come in as conquerors, but they also embrace Sunni Islam, and the ulama essentially make a deal with them that you rule and apply the Sharia. We will not touch what you're doing. But when it comes to cities, when it comes to ruling, the Sharia rules. And when it comes to politics and who is the king, that's your business. We're not going to deal with that, right? So there is it secularism? I can't say that this is secularism in any sense, because these people are ruling by the Sharia. They're applying the law of Sharia. They are seen as merely executioners of the Sharia, right? They are, if you will, the executive branch of the Sharia. But there is no organic, no strong link between the people of the cities, between Muslims that they rule, the subjects, and the rulers. They speak different languages, they have different ways of living. They may both be Muslims, but they belong to very different cultures. And this ruling class is not, so for example, there are often accounts of them drinking and even killing their brothers and stuff like that, that ordinary Muslims would be appalled by. Yet, when it comes to applying the law, they would never question that that law is the Sharia, and the ulama decide what to do, and so on and so forth, right? So there is this really interesting split that Muslims begin to live with. Yes?
Can the present day Saudi Arabia be compared to?
Oh, excellent question, sister. Can the present day Saudi be compared to this setup? Yes. In some ways, present day Saudi is like this. Yes?
Can we say that the ulama realized that living in a non-Muslim land, in a land ruled by non-Muslims, in a better, is not better than ruled by, I'm not putting it correctly, but a not so observant Muslim is better than being ruled by a non-Muslim? Well,
there's no non-Muslim here so far.
No, non-Muslim in the sense Sunni and Shia.
Well, yeah, they don't, I mean, yes, so they say that, look, as somebody who supports Sunnah and the Sunni ulama is better than Shia, right? So that's certainly one consideration. But also, another very interesting thing that happens at the time is in the year 1071, somewhere here, no, somewhere over there, Sunni Seljuks, the Byzantines, that is, remember the part of the Byzantine Empire that Muslims did not conquer, that 1/3 that was left? They become strong and they are attacking Muslims. And Muslims are quite weak and divided. So in the year 1071, which is 470, like in the 5th century, around, as I said, around here, Sunni Seljuks, these people defeat the Christian Byzantine army. This is in the Battle of Manzikert. It's an important, or Malazgard or Manzikert. That was a major battle that reminded people of, the early victories. And so people realize how important it is to have an army that can fight the enemy, right? So ulama's hearts, if you will, became soft toward these new rulers, foreign rulers, because number one, they're going to protect you from an external enemy, Christians, and number two, they're going to protect Sunni Islam. So you have to deal with them, even though themselves they may be a little barbaric. Okay, so those are the compromises that people are going to have to make at this time in what is called the Sultanic or Sultanistic period. All right, we'll take a break now. Jazakumullah khair.